Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. How are you doing? Welcome, welcome, welcome to all of you, on-site, online. I'm thrilled to have this moment to kick off our Kneller Lecture by Professor David Reynolds from Hangzhou Normal University. I welcome all of you, not only from the United States, Canada, or nearby countries, but also globally. CIES is traditionally a global community. I'm so proud of you. By the way, I just want to update our audience before we start this session. This year, we have over 3,600 participants registered. I view that as a strong piece of evidence that our CIES community is recovering well from the 3 years pandemic. I'm so happy for that. I hope during the conference you enjoy all the sessions, your individual presentations, our key plenary events organized. Don't forget about your about the updates sent from our organizing team. Today, we will have the traditional Kneller Lecture. I'm so honored to have the chance to send the invitation to Dr. David Reynolds, a globally recognized expert in school effectiveness and educational improvement. His title today is Education Without Failure, Some Practical Proposals for Educational Change. I'm also extremely honored to have Professor Martin Connoy from Stanford University and Dr. Brianna Kurtz from Mary Baldwin University, who will be serving as the two commentators for the lecture. Thank you very, very much. Since the World War II, especially after 1970s, a global trend focusing on compulsory education, and as a consequence of that, the key concern and the research focus have been on school effectiveness. And Professor David Reynolds is one of those pioneers in the field. By this point, I believe probably most of you also, we have finished a lot of research on school effectiveness, but how education can be really improved remain a big concern. And that's how come we have this important session. So please allow me to save the time to introduce our lecturer today and also our two commentators. My strategy is to introduce our Kneller Lecture first, then save the time. After his talk, I will introduce our two commentators. I hope that will be okay to you. Thank you very much. Actually, you don't really need me to introduce these three guests, but still, I just want to read this out. David Professor David Reynolds is one of the founders and the leaders of the international school effectiveness and improvement community, has researched and practiced school improvement for almost 50 years. He grew up in Norfolk, England, where he attended church schools, and then the University of Essex, the UK's foremost social sciences university. He did training in the medical school research council unit run by the legendary Professor R.K. Cochrane. Sorry for that. I think I should take off my glasses. Sorry for that. He went from there to research and posts at Cardiff University, Newcastle University, Exeter University, Plymouth University, Southampton University, and finally to set up the new education department at the Swansea University in Wales. His last post was as a distinguished professor in the Jinhengting School of Education at Hangzhou Normal University. Professor David Reynolds extensively published. Of course, I will not read out the long list of his publications. Otherwise, we will not have time to enjoy his talk. So please allow me to invite Professor David Reynolds. Please, David.
Good morning to you, and thank you for coming. And I'm very much looking forward to talking to you and interacting with you today and for the rest of the conference. Being here starts for me reminding me of the times I used to come here with my kids on the family trips to Disney. But this changed for me in 1976 because I was invited to a conference about effective schools, and the conference was held in Florida. It was the first major academic conference I'd ever been to, and I arrived jet-lagged, sweaty, nervy, and conscious of the fact that I was going as an effective schools spokesperson into America, who had had effective schools and done it and walked away from it and was very critical of the entire movement, and a movement which had really largely atrophied and had frankly petered out into third-rate money-making. It had always been a money-making industry, as it were. People would go and do the talks in schools. After the talk, the persons doing the talk sometimes would have been in the playground selling their wares. It had a commercial kind of aim to it as well. And what I'd like to do is to take you through my experience of that first visit. I was introduced by a very famous, still-going professor of education called Serene Bucock. You maybe have heard the name. She's very well known and was then and is now a fine person who has done wonderful work. And she, from the front, said, "Here's David Reynolds," she said, with a wry grin on her face, "who persists in believing schools make a difference." After which there was prolonged, thunderous laughter, because you couldn't say in those days that schools make a difference because we had had Coleman, we had had the failure of lots of social engineering attempts to do things with schools. I mean, nobody believed that schools mattered. Nobody believed that schools make a difference. And so everybody laughed. Here is David Reynolds, who persists in believing schools make a difference. But those days are gone. The laughter now would be if somebody said schools don't make a difference. That's the change in the paradigm that you and we inhabit. And what happened was the controversial rise of a movement that replaced the old effective schools movement, which was partly money-making, which has just died, a new kind of movement based on trying to use empirical evidence, trying to make us research-based, trying to learn and move on, trying to learn from other social science disciplines, whereas the old effective schooling stuff didn't really learn from anybody. It was largely, as it were, an afterthought. So things have changed, and I think everywhere people have bought into a new kind of effective schools story. What I'm going to do is take you through the history of the new effective schools story and what we have to give you, because I mean, my feeling every time I've come to America is that people hear effective schools, the phrase, and think we did it. It's gone. That's history, without knowing what we can offer to practitioners and researchers now. So I want to take a quick trip through what the discipline is like now, in the hope that it'll be helpful to you and you can interact with it. Okay, we've now got some very good ideas about what effective educational practices are, moving on from the awful, jaw-dropping simplicity of 5 factors or 7 factors or whatever, which is what we were. So we have a massive research now about what makes schools effective. Literally hundreds, thousands of studies. The International Congress for School Effectiveness that meets annually has been to 40 different parts of the world. It actually goes round, and each place we go, we find more people who do research, but the present kind of research, not the old kind of stuff. But what does it tell us at the moment? Well, what we get is very good pictures about what are called the effective schools factors. And this massive research is reducible to 3 big things: cohesion, the big C's, cohesion, consistency, and constancy. That gives you control. So the first big C, as it were, is control. Secondly, the effective schools literature shows that in schools like organizations outside schools, high expectations matter. It's interesting to see in your society the much criticized and much ostracized stuff about teacher expectations historically, which was everywhere when I started social science in the 70s and 80s. That has come back in a popular sense rather than a research sense, but it's interesting that it's come back. So there's control, there's high expectations, there's, and it always sounds slightly unpleasant, this, and kind of macho, firm leadership, but it's true. Leaders who know what they're doing, know where they're going, because if you don't know those 2 things, no one will follow and no one will gain. It's not an argument for macho leadership, it's an argument for firm but listening leadership. Fourthly, a focus upon learning is what the field says is important. A positive school climate. I'll rattle through this because there are other more important things to do. Sixthly, keeping attention upon the progress of the students to see if they're performing, or seeing how you're doing at any particular stage. Seventhly, the involvement of parents and caretakers, not because it's a good thing to do, but it actually gives you enhanced results. It means that your school can go in your home, helped by the parents to get it through to your children. Eighthly, high-quality professional development of all staff, and the importance of that has clearly been seen in the pandemic days that you've had. I'll talk about the pandemic quickly later. Involving students in the lives of schools, having effective teachers, multiple behavioral things that teachers can do to actually get knowledge over to children. And all these factors and characteristics can be maximized in the use, utility, and reach by high-quality professional development. So there are lots of things that we know. You might be thinking the old effective schools had five-factor theories. Here are 10, and we're still going. A more complex and more nuanced knowledge base. Okay, one area that we moved on to after establishing the characteristics of effective schools is actually how do we improve schools? We haven't necessarily been particularly effective in doing that. So what is the knowledge base about school improvement? Okay. Sorry, which one? This is the usual exercise in self-degradation and humiliation. Right. Okay. Improving schools, you say. We've moved into the areas of trying to make schools better in terms of improving the educational outcomes. And there's a good knowledge base around. I think probably school improvement, I don't know what you think, I don't know if you know these knowledge bases. School improvement was always the weak link in the chain. We had things that we knew, but actually getting it into schools was very, very difficult. And one person said that school improvement was mostly, quote, good intentions and a sound filing system. And that's really, I mean, it's pretty rude, but it was rather like that. You simply had knowledge, you took it along to schools and practitioners, you assumed that they would pick it up and run with it. Very often they didn't. So the whole area of improving schools and getting our knowledge bases, which are now extensive, huge knowledge bases, over to people. And that, in part, that means resetting the dial from the awful days of the 1960s of people going around school playgrounds, flogging effective schools merchandise. It means resetting a dial that we went off then. So improving schools, we need a knowledge base there, and we haven't necessarily got it. We put a lot of faith into IT, and we thought that would do it for us. I mean, it hasn't. But that actually stopped people thinking, I think, about what else there wasn't IT that you need to do to improve schools. That was the big kind of white horse, and that didn't happen. And I'm not certain people have really thought through how we can improve schools. How do we get the knowledge in? How do we get it taken up? How do we get it into teaching? These are all areas where we urgently need to go. And the present unreliability of the education system post-pandemic stands really in stark contrast to other social and economic systems in our societies. If our planes in our skies were as unreliable as our schools, you wouldn't fly. But the children go to school. We put up with unreliable schools, with trial and error educational procedures, and in some cases, manifestly ineffective practices. Maybe in most of the surveys, most of you here, I think, will probably think the same, and this is the kind of Brit figure as well, perhaps 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 of your schools are poor or fall some way short of providing acceptable standards of education. If there was a 1 in 6 or 7 chance of your plane crashing, and there is a 1 in 6 chance of your schools or the schools for your kids not being very good, if there was that chance, you wouldn't put up with it, you wouldn't fly. I hope the analogy works for you. You put up with one thing as a society, Britain the same, 1 in 7 schools not very good, but none of us would put up with that as we stand in the queue to fly. And yet children and their lives matter as much as us. And the economic damage to education systems and what they're doing to us, that economic damage, that is worth several jumbo jet crashes each day. and we do nothing. We bother about one, we don't bother about the other. We forbid one, we legislate the other out. But we don't seem to have the same judgment call on schools, do we? But there's a sense in which the cavalry has arrived, and it's arrived in the sense of the study of what have been called highly reliable schools. The research here and practice here started, I think it was in the West Coast. And it started, I think it was called the Far West Lab, a group of people who started to look at the characteristics of organizations who aren't allowed to fail. So these organizations are required to work right first time, all the time. No excuses, no home background. An air traffic control tower is not allowed to let jumbo jets collide through fog, snow, computer failure, pestilence. With thousands of flights a day leaving and landing at airports, there's never been a collision in the sky. How many zillion jets have flown? How many zillion trips have people made? Not one. They've been crashed on, you're thinking he's wrong. They've been crashed on the runway, yes. And they've been crashed just above the runway, yes. But not, as it were, heading along in flight. There's never been one. And that's because we bother about the organizations doing the controlling, I was going to say driving of the plane, the piloting of the plane, etc. That's because we bother about all this. So let's look at what these high reliability organizations do. And being of a fairly simple nature, people like me thought, well, maybe if we've got these organizations and they aren't allowed to fail, shouldn't we pay some attention to them when it comes to thinking of what we do in our schools? Surely a workable concept in one area of society is worth playing with in another area, like education. Why not give it a go? It's not as if it's a perfect educational world that we inhabit at the moment. So the characteristics of the high reliability organizations are as follows. Sorry, I've now got ahead. The characteristics are as follows. The high reliability organizations emerge when the larger society and the relevant professions together judge that the failure of these organizations will not be tolerated. The organizations require clarity of goals to be clear about their tasks. The job of the pilot is to fly the plane, not to be the cockpit expert in wine tasting. The food may be tasteless, but you don't die. These organizations are constantly alert to lapses or ineffectiveness or inefficiencies, where small failures can cascade into major system failure. What they avoid is the cascading error, where things get worse and worse, starting with something small, which cascades into something large and horrific. These organizations have standard operating procedures that have definitions of good practice that are applicable in a wide variety of individual settings. They honor the flaw finders, the person who says, this isn't working, or this is going to go, or this engine's going to blow. They don't get thrown out. They actually get rewarded and promoted because you need flaw finders. Although I think maybe your Boeing company had a bit of difficulty in that area. They honor flaw finders. They recruit aggressively. The organizations recruit aggressively and coherently. They train intensively. Training ain't a dirty word, as the in-service training sometimes is in schools. They are continuously evaluated with organizations' goals, structure, and measurement by systems to manage how they're doing, so we know at all time points if they're doing well or badly. They're hierarchically and vertically structured, but they're very vertical. There are people who have power, and they have more power than the people beneath them. But the organizations can go flat, if necessary, when there's a particular crisis in a plane or an airfield, airport. Organizations can remarkably go flat, where people in higher positions in a hierarchy will join with others in a communal response to trouble. And the great thing is the organizations and the staff are widely valued in the society outside. All these characteristics, if you want a high reliability organization, are necessary as a group, because if you miss just one, you're still in trouble. And our problem is that we've really got trial and error education, not high reliability education. We move from not very wonderful organizational procedures in some of our schools to still not very wonderful, but we move. Our systems of education lack reliability. We can't deliver anything with certainty. We lack reliability, fidelity of organization. So we don't necessarily have what the other organizations have. And what we do have in society is something that we can call cascading errors. We've got now the perfect opportunities for every person, every minute of every day, all of us, to get involved with cascading errors. A few hundred years ago, when societies were rural and people were relatively isolated from each other, if you messed up, if you were the family that messed up in a particular patch of ground, if you didn't get the wheat in, ultimately, unless you had support from your community, I mean, they would go to the wall. There were consequences. Nowadays, specialization within societies means we are dependent, interdependent in ways that we weren't then. We were atomized persons. We were people living in farms with little contact. So if a farmer messed up, it affected only his or her family or the people in the farm. Now, if we mess up, it affects everybody because we are so interconnected. We're interconnected because that's the way to make money. It's the way to make progress. It's the way that one can reach advanced goals in various different areas. That's why. But there is potentially a downside. And if I just say the word Bhopal, you'll know what that downside was. Bhopal was a cascading error when a chemical plant in India blew up. The problem was started by a 2 rupee nut coming off the stack that was in the plant in Bhopal. The cause of probably millions of deaths was the 3 rupee nut. It was a cascading error. If you have connectivity and connections, the difficulty is that you can get these cascading errors with appalling consequences. So, we've all benefited from the improved fit between individuals and their skills. Differentiation gives us that. People can, horses for courses, we can find people where they should be. That is what we get. Not everybody trying to be the farmer that supports their family and keeps their family going. But somehow what we need is to recognize that the social maintenance of society that encourages and permits specialization, that basically means we are all living in each other's pockets. We live in each other's pockets even if we don't want to or like to, because the economic model is that's the way that better production is done. And that's, of course, why schools matter. And schools now have to prepare schools in and out of school for their future lives, and yet also maintain the links and the relationships between people that we need to carry on in the society. And that actually is the great function of school that no other organization can do. Everybody's there. Everybody there is there with the people that they will relate to, be influenced by. They are communities, ideally. That's the historic purpose of school in a society. The problem of professional development, though, is with us writ large. I don't know about your society. Professional development does not seem to have been a particular focus of schools, or for that matter, research in my society. PD has been often about curriculum more than it's been about organization. It was regarded, I think, a bit vulgar to do organizational stuff in the professional development day. You did other kinds of things. Professional development had attention from the 1980s, but is still very variable. And it's very difficult to be anything other than concerned about professional development in the UK and here. And I guess the problem with professional development, I think the first time I've ever seen this happen, I think people would quietly whisper that the PD isn't particularly a strong part of our education system. I imagine they used to whisper it here too. It wasn't till the pandemic that one actually realized that we didn't have professions with the skills that were necessary in an uncertain world. And we didn't realize it until the pandemic came. And we didn't realize that we hadn't done things we should have done. And so the old professional development, subject-based, curriculum-based, you know, the embarrassment of I don't know whether you had this in the States, the first professional development day of the year was where you spent a few hours opening the mail that's accumulated in the office over the summer holiday. You know, life shouldn't be like that. Those are valuable times. The concern about professional development is, I think, thoroughly justifiable, and it's very, very important that we create professional development. And focusing the professional development on high-quality literatures like effective schools and related literatures, I think, is the way forward. There's one area, there's always, this is America, there's an arrival of the cavalry. There's always, not always, there is this time some hope, and that comes from the area of brain science. We haven't really had interventions which are powerful and cheap. They've normally been resource-based, or at the very least they require accessing bodies of knowledge outside to bring to the school, which also costs time, as it were, and money. The brain science stuff is interesting, in particular a story about the cerebellum, which is the back of the head. It's the tangerine-sized bit at the back of your skull, which was called historically the hindbrain, and which is now known as the brain's brain to the people who are into this. The cerebellum is the brain's brain. And some of the biggest effects that I've ever seen in my life from interventions come from very, very simple, and for simple read, easy to do, so they're great for us. They don't require huge bodies of knowledge. Some of these interventions really have huge effects. They're potentiated by exercise regimes. You stimulate the cerebellum by varieties of exercises. You balance on a wobble board. I've done it. Balance on a wobble board, which used to be around, I think, in schools. Not so many of them now. Balance on a wobble board. You can go upstairs, and then upstairs and downstairs without falling over with your eyes shut. Conkers, of course, was part of this tradition of brain training by very, very simple things. That's the purpose. There was some school effectiveness person in history that realized that conkers were just amazing in terms of hand-eye coordination. Hand-eye coordination gets the brain. Anyway, there's lots of evidence now about the importance of the brain directly, as it were, and the importance of exercise routines that can give you huge, huge bangs for virtually no bucks. Okay. My feeling is, to conclude, is that in education and in education research in America, you've actually shot yourselves in the feet. Please don't think it's some arrogant Brit coming here to tell you things, you know, that you really don't want to hear. It's from somebody who loves America, who's been coming to America probably once or twice a year for the whole of his life, starting with the kids in Disney and moving on to academic trips. My fear is that you've shot yourselves in the foot. You've shot yourselves in the foot because in most of the major industrial societies, there is a school effectiveness tradition. there's a presence. It's not necessarily a field itself which is developing particularly rapidly, although it is doing it now as it gets into the cerebellum. But there's this tradition which is gone. You had it here, you had some of it, the very simple stuff, but you never picked up the new Mark II or III, the stuff where we really have got things for professionals. You have limited school improvement research and limited knowledge about what to do. And that tradition has been really damaged by, being quite honest, the Marzano industry, because it is an industry, took the high reliability phrase as its trademark name, which is really pretty naughty. It's trademarked now. When Marzano took that as its trademark name and then took whatever knowledge base he and his colleagues had and attached that. And while other countries have, I think, motored in many ways in the areas of effectiveness and efficiency these last 10, 20, 30 years as it's gone around the planet and got better, you haven't. You've ignored it because it used to be the people that came to the school playground and flogged the pamphlets at break time. You need to forget those days if you could. And I think also you've probably got a limited exercise in some of the cerebellum stuff. There are places in the world where that has taken off, but here I don't think is one of them. I think education research in my field needs you. It needs the perspectives that you have. It needs the environment that you have. It needs the traditions that you have. It needs your excellence in the psychology area, particularly because British psychology in the school improvement area is not good. So it's very important that for the future sake of the planet, for you to be in educational research, you are in education research, but in education research in my areas, school effectiveness, school improvement, new brain stuff. We have, I think, the technology from educational effectiveness and related areas, which is there for you. Schools were, I think, and you have the traditions too of the UK comprehensive school. Schools where all children go, where all children learn, and where they receive enduring truths about the world from the teachers who know these things to be true and who can deliver them because they are in great schools. We have that technology, and I honestly think it's time for you to pick some of it up and use it, and you'll find it helpful, I hope, and we'll find you useful and helpful too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor David Reynolds, for your fabulous and enjoyable lecture. I'm not only inspired, but also enlightened. I hope you also enjoy the lecture. We have our online participants. For those who Zoom in, please ask your question in the chat box or in the Q&A box so that we can take your questions. Please, sorry, I forgot to introduce the structure. So the next will be introduce our two commentators. Then each of them will be given 5 minutes to provide their comments. Then we will open around 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, then the conclusion of the session. So now please allow me to introduce our two commentators. First, I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Brianna Kurtz. She is an assistant professor at Mary Baldwin University. Her focus is on mathematics education with a certificate in comparative and international education. She has been extensively published and also has extensive experiences in Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, right? Dr. Bryce, right? So the next is our Dr. Martin Conroy. You all know you don't need my introduction, right? But still, I want to introduce a little bit formally. He is a Vida Jacks Professor of Education and Economics at Stanford University. He is co-director of the Lehman Center at Stanford University. Of course, our dear past president. I should not forget about that. His books include The State and the Political Theory. That's in the very early stage, 1984. And the new ones, The Law Achievement Trap, Comparing Schools in Botswana and South Africa. That was published in 2012. And there are newer ones, The Political Economy of Education, that will be coming very soon by Cambridge University Press this fall. Please allow me to invite these two commentators to come to the stage to make their comments. So, Brianna, could you please, both of you? First, please allow me to invite Dr. Brianna Kurtz, please. 5 minutes for you, please.
All right, I'll set a little timer here because thank you, cell phones. So, like I said, I'm Brianna Kurtz. I am from Mary Baldwin University in Stanton, Virginia. It is a small rural school, and I want to just thank June and thank you so much, David, for all the wonderful things that we heard today. There's a lot to comment on, but I wanted to make sure to hit on some pieces to speak to some of our experiences, and I can't wait to hear your words too. Nobody believes schools make a difference. I remember very distinctly a shift in that. It was approximately March 16th of 2020 here in the United States. Because I was on social media. Can I just stand up? It feels too, I want this to be real here. I'm sorry, this feels too formal, and I think if something is true about what we've gone through in our country, we all wear formal tops and Zoom pants, let's be honest. So in March of 2020, I saw memes everywhere. There was a rallying around teachers that I had not seen in my entire career. There were memes that said, students are not a delight, you lied on the report cards. There was a rallying that I haven't seen since September 11th, which was my freshman year of college, and I remember that rallying. And for months, we had educational support, and people are believing in the things that we were hearing. Technology was free. Resources were free. For rural districts like the ones that I helped to serve, we had people going out and providing different high-speed access so students could learn and that we could develop as teachers, as educators, and as teacher educators. Then 6 months later, everything went behind a paywall. And all of a sudden, education was no longer that right. Teacher professional development was no longer a right. It went back to a privilege for the few again. So these problems that we have been seeing now for 50 years, things have not changed, but we have a chance now. Sorry, I was making so many notes. Cohesion, consistency, and constancy. Our students in our communities felt that in the rallying. Now, maybe our leaders didn't know what was happening because we didn't know what was happening. But we were still able to come together to provide something that looked new and something that looked different. And to have a revolution that we've been talking about for 50 years, 50 years of research. I'll admit my age because I'm turning 40 this year and I don't know what I'm going to do about it yet. But that's years of research that is longer than my life. And we're still having the same conversation. We have a chance now to have a different conversation. And that's what Dr. Reynolds is talking about here today. So when we're looking at all these different supports for teachers, support for schools, getting education and high-speed technology access to be a right, getting professional development to be a right, or making it based in science and research that's happening right now. That's something that we could talk about and get behind. Now, we are all in each other's little nooks and crannies. Look at everybody around us today. We have people here who are academics. Raise your hand if you're here from a university today. Okay. Raise your hand if you're from an NGO. Raise your hand if you are from some kind of government organization that I have not listed. All right, thank you. We have all the players from different places in one room, and for a whole week to have these conversations so that we can actually put theory into practice. So what is stopping us? What is stopping us from rallying behind our teachers, from doing the practices that we know will work, and for getting everybody behind it and getting it out of a paywall? When we can make those changes, that's when things are going to be different. And that's when we can actually see education become a right. And we can stop spinning our wheels and having the same conversations over and over, so that whoever's in this room now in another 50 years isn't having the same conversation. I teach math. When I show my students pictures of what a math classroom looks like in 1940, it looks like it does in 2023. What else looks the same? So, I'm just saying today, I can't wait for this conversation because I can't wait to get together to talk about how we're going to give those students, the teachers, the schools, that cohesion, consistency, and constancy that we got to hear about today that's actually going to bring people to the table. So let's make a change. What else we got to do?
Thank you so much, Brianna, for a wonderful comment. So next, please allow me to invite Professor Martin Connoy, please. Slides, please.
Thank you, Vice President Lee. That's your title, isn't it?
President-elect.
President-elect, sorry. I was that many years ago. Anyway, and thanks very much, David, for your talk. I think that I'm not going to take the bait of a Brit telling us about the defectiveness in our research work. So I'm not going to do that. So can I get the next slide? Okay, so let me put it this way, that for at least the last 30 years, and I would even say the last 50 years, I don't know what happened to you in Florida. It was quite traumatic, I think. Anyway, but even in early 70s, I guess that's when it was? Yeah. So even in the early 70s, economists were doing production functions in education. And I'd like to point out that even with the Coleman report, immediately two economists, Bowles and Levin, wrote a counter to the Coleman report, arguing that if you just inverted the way the variables were put into the regression equation, then schools would explain a lot rather than social class. Why? Because the two things are highly correlated, and I want to talk to you about that today. So we've agreed that quality can make a difference in students' learning for at least 30 years and probably 50 years. And most of the research work has not been on effective schools. You're quite right about that. The effective schools movement in the United States, I think for good reason, fell apart. But it was replaced by social scientists working on on what works, on production functions, but all in the spirit that schools make a difference. And but there's also convincing data that there's considerable variation in gains in test scores among school districts, states over time, and even that education reforms at the state level in federal countries can have enormous impact on gain scores. And let me just show you one example of, next slide. Connecticut versus Massachusetts in the early 2000s. Look at this. This is our national test, the NAEP, in 8th grade math. This will make you feel a little bit better. In 8th grade math, that the test scores in Massachusetts were going up at the same rate as Connecticut until 2003. Boom, in 10 years, they increased over Connecticut. Very similar states, right? Everything about them is similar, small, have about the same heterogeneity of race and class. And math scores in Massachusetts went up a half a standard deviation compared to Connecticut. And we kind of know why that happened. It was a concerted effort, political and economic, in Massachusetts to do this. Next slide, please. And so they knew how to do it. They knew how to do it. The fact is, they knew how to do it, and they did it. They put a lot of effort into it. It was coordinated, required accountability and tests. I'm going to say a bad word. The tests actually helped. And all of this worked. But here's a caveat. It's also true that social class differences among students and difference in average social class of the schools that students attend are the two most important variables explaining achievement differences among students in almost every country, state, and school district in the world. So we know how to make schools more effective, but we also know this. This is a fact. And the evidence also suggests that even when clever politicians, educational experts, and reformers figure out how to raise student achievement, following some of the advice that David presented, it is much rarer that they can close the social class gap or the race gap, where that it may also play an important role in differences. Next slide, please. So here's just one example. Here's a recent study we did in Brazil, and we looked at the bottom 25th percentile. We also looked at bottom 10 percentile versus the top 25th percentile in test scores. Now, this in math. They went up even more, by the way, in Portuguese. So they went up. They went up over this period quite a bit. And yet, in fact, the gap increased in the 5th grade. It didn't increase in the 9th grade, but it didn't get narrower. And at the college entrance test, they narrowed slightly. Slightly. This was at 12th grade. So these gaps aren't closing. Even early childhood education, which you would expect would narrow the gap because it would sort of fill the void of parents that are working too hard, both parents working, don't have time, spend with the kids, put the kids in care, which is not very stimulating. You'd think that child care or good daycare would close the gap in primary school. It doesn't. It raises the scores of everybody, but it doesn't close the gap. Next slide, please. So, to finish up in my 5 minutes of fame, as Warhol would put it, if we know how to increase student achievement, and the evidence suggests that we do, why is it that many countries, states, districts, and schools have made such small gains in achievement over the past 20 years? And especially once we control for increases in student social class. Because student social class also going up, we have growth. So why not? Why hasn't this happened? Why haven't we followed David's advice? Why haven't we looked at all this effective school stuff? Why haven't we taken all the stuff that economists have showed and just made these massive changes? Now, some have. Some have, but relatively few. And in keeping with the theme of the conference, if we know how to make schools better, why is it even less likely, indeed very rare, that the achievement gap between students with low and high levels of family resources is reduced over the course of their schooling? And we know how to do that too, by the way. So why is it that the relative average achievement of low and high social class students stays rather constant over time, even as average scores rise and fall? I leave that hanging in the air for the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Martin Collin, and also Brianna Kurtz, for the wonderful comments and also burning questions. So please allow me to invite Professor David Reynolds to briefly respond to them. Then I will open the floor to questions. Please.
The three.
What?
You want me to respond?
Yes. Could you please? Yeah. Thank you.
If I can go through the three. If we know is to increase student achievement, I mean, why is it that everybody's pretty much at the same level as they were a while back? I think it may well be that the things that we know and the things that we've done are two different things. I mean, we know an awful lot of things in the kind of school ethos, school culture area, but they may not necessarily have been done because we lack the improvement mechanisms to get them in. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, there are truths that aren't resources. There are truths that are school culture, that are the ambience of a school, the expectations of a school, but we may not necessarily have the delivery mechanism for those in the way that we got a delivery mechanism, for example, for school class size. These are difficult areas in which we should have gone, and we should have developed mechanisms for these more difficult areas, and we haven't. And it's an embarrassment, and there are enough people in effectiveness now that it should have happened. Shall I say quickly about the second one?
Yeah, can you put back the PPT slide back?
I'll be very quick. So, sorry, do you see the point I'm making about the first one? I mean, it's knowledge bases we lack. I mean, don't doubt the importance of the area, but there are knowledge places we haven't gone that we should have gone, particularly the improvement area. I'll just try with the other two if you can get me.
Yeah, the second one is in keeping with the theme of this conference. If we know how to make schools better, why it is even less likely, indeed, very rare, that the achievement gap between students with low and higher levels of family resources is reduced over the course of their schooling. That's the second question.
It sounds like a cop-out. I don't think it is. I mean, I'm assuming that the problem is those effects are cumulative in schools, and the differences build on difference. And there's nothing, as it were, to undo that. Yeah? Would that make, is that a possible explanation that they happen, and then because they've happened, they carry on, and they get reinforced?
I think you're just tending to put everything on the schools. The schools are situated in societies, and societies make decisions about these institutions. So, I mean, I agree with you that schools can also do this. It's clear that there is tremendous variation in what schools do in terms of their effectiveness. No disagreement at all. But I just think that when you talk about the big gains, like in Massachusetts versus Connecticut, or in North Carolina, or even in Texas, you know, believe it or not, Texas and Massachusetts back in 2013 had the highest test scores in the country together, and there was a concerted effort in Texas to do that. So it's possible. So I agree 100% with that. But on the other hand, Australia's test scores have gone down, PISA scores have gone down by 1/3 of a standard deviation in 20 years. Down. And the question is, why has that happened? So I think it's outside of schools is pretty important stuff. That's my only point.
No, I accept that. It's wrong. It's wrong to say that societies can make up, or schools can make up for all manner of everything that's wrong with a society. Because school influence is, if you look at the sense of variance explained, maybe 15, maybe 20%, sometimes 25%, not 100%, and not as big as the influence of genetics, and not as big as the influence of social conditions outside. But I'd make the point again, I hope that came over during my presentation. I mean, if there are positive outliers, we need to learn. For a lot of the time, they will be doing things that are reproducible. And sometimes, although the average school effect may be 15 or 20, I mean, finding a school effect of 30 or 40 or 50, which you can find. Some of the great black schools in the UK, when we had migration, and London was transformed by an influx of black students and committed teachers, often black, who actually transformed education. Now that, you can get big changes like that within an overall figure internationally where you're right. Do you see what I'm saying? There are outliers within this area too, yeah? And we can chase them and find them. You know, which country, which bit, which school, and learn from them. You may be right in terms of averages, you are right, but within that will hide beyond effective schools, yeah?
We also, sorry, just to jump in on that comment, but we also need to be asking the question that's the elephant in the room. Is PISA and what we are basing that on testing what we want students to know in this century? Hey, look, question answered. Okay, our job is done. And if that's the case, then are we making sure that our school overhauls and our measures to overhaul education are based not just on the test scores for a test whose design may be dated, but really looking at what we want students to learn to be effective members of a changing society? So.
Thank you very much.
You know, let me say something on professional development. So in California, I discovered that California was spending $500 million a year on professional development. And my wife taught in the school district for 40 years, and she told me about professional development in her school district 5 days a year. And it was basically a cottage industry for professors in community colleges, this was your point, running around and selling stuff that, for the most part, was totally irrelevant to teaching better math, for example. And 5 days a year is questionable too. So the question is that I would raise is, we've known this. We've known this for 30, 40 years. Any teacher can tell you about this. And this, by the way, true in almost every country of the world. So why is that happening? When we know this, why are teachers put in 5 days a year in stuff that has no meaning for their teaching? So why do we do it? And it's resource rich, by the way. We're spending a lot of money on it. You know, who's doing this? The hand of God. The invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand, is giving us bad professional development, which is costing a lot of money. Really makes sense.
Thank you very, very much. I must stop that right now because I do want we have some time for our participants online and on-site. But I really appreciate the heated discussions started already. Thank you very much. Now, it's your time. That lady in red, please.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring, presentations and comments. But it was very disappointing for me is that you're focusing on test scores. And for me, like, school bullying is a failure, is another failure. Hungry students sitting in a classroom is another failure. Teenagers committing suicide is another failure. So there are many other aspects in the schooling process that we need to focus on and look at. And they are equally important, like test scores. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. To keep your question very brief, can I take another question so that we can make it more efficient, please? Yeah, he was. Yes. Coming.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. If I go with your analog, I expect the schools to create, effective schools will create the informed society. If a school creates the society which is informed, I expect that this society will be able to improve school. But unfortunately, our school is ineffective, and the ineffective schools create uninformed or poor society academically. How do you expect this society to transform schools while we understand that this society is the product of this school? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more question from here.
Hi, this is Maria Rombalcera from ActionAid on the Tax and Education Alliance. My question is about resources. So you were mentioning about how much money we are putting into, let's say, for-profit corporations that are actually mushrooming in a way that for this professional development, and we see it in all countries, we are creating this type of industry which is linked to the school failure mantra, ideology. I don't know how to put it because, you know, it's about how we measure that and what we do about it. But it also has to do with the inadequate education financing that we see everywhere. And we also, it's not only about the money that goes there, but how it's spent. And we know that per pupil, those in the highest percentiles get a lot more money, especially along the whole education life. So how do we make schools more effective? How do we solve this school failure, you want to call it that? And could you also talk about the education financing? Because I think that this is the big elephant in the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these wonderful questions. Now, please.
One of the interesting developments in the last few years, it should have been 20 years ago, but other things had to be done first, I guess. One of the most interesting things in the last few years is looking at variation within schools. And if you do that, you'll actually find that a colleague at the back talked about being an ineffective school or ineffective schools. If you look at ineffective schools, they're interesting, they're kind of paradoxical, because they will have the ineffective school will have the biggest range of within-school variation of all, right up to the excellent and the wonderful. Being an ineffective school because of within-school variation doesn't necessarily mean all teachers are, in inverted commas, ineffective. And the development, this is one of the things that's come out of school effectiveness in the last few years, as people have started to look at the within-school variation. And that's the fascinating thing. It's why I responded when you talked about finding schools that were doing the job, as it were, and finding difficult to do that. If you get whole groups, that will hide the range of variation within a group. If you get a group mean, a group average. And therefore, if one looks at the ineffective schools in particular, they will have the biggest range of all, which means they've got, bizarrely, some of them, the biggest possibility of all, because they're so out of sync, they're so poorly managed, they go from that to that. But you can find that in your ineffective schools. That's the great, there is always good practice there.
Microphone.
Hello? There is always, sorry, I was getting carried away. There's always good practice there, and you just need to find it. And the difficulty in finding it is to have a culture that makes it acceptable for you to go around finding it and for you to talk to people and understand it. So it's not easy. But the within-school range issue is a transformative one, because it means that probably every school could be changeable from within itself by getting at its good practice before its good practice has enough of the school and wanders from that school and finds a good school.
You want to respond, please?
Well, you know, I'm not so worried about professional development funding because there's lots of it everywhere. But the problem with training teachers is that trainers have to know something. So most professional development facilitators are actually teachers. And so they tend to teach the teachers they're teaching in the practices that they know how to do. So nobody's even taught them how to teach adults rather than children. So they're teachers of children now being asked to teach adults. So there's a lot of problems that way. But the simple, we're dealing with this in Brazil on a large scale. Every governor and every secretary of education of a state wants to train all 150,000 teachers in their state, like Sao Paulo, at once, okay? The idea of training 10% of the teachers every year over 10 years never enters into their head in order to multiply by 10 the number of days of professional development, increase the investment in the quality of teachers and things like that. So when you see that, and you see that kind of thinking, and even if I'm willing to go beyond, and I have to say that I think most societies don't even care about this. They don't really care whether low-income kids get good education. They just don't care. So how are you going to change that attitude? So, fine. Look at the effect of schools and find out what to do. How are you going to convince them that these effective schools can be multiplied by 100, by 1,000 under the right circumstances, the right effort? Somebody's got to make the effort. And where is that going to come from? It's political. It's political. Somebody has to be forced to do that because it's not happening on its own. It's not happening on its own. Listen, black kids in this country, until 1940, attended schools where there were no resources. Teachers were hardly paid, alongside white kids in the same state who had all the resources. Nobody said, hey, wait, something's wrong with that. We know how to do better schools. So really, folks, figure out when these changes take place, how they happened, why they happened, not just that we know how to do it.
Thanks so much, Brianna. Do you want? I'm aware of the time, so please.
I'll
please
talk
speak.
really fast. Okay, I was mainly wanting to address a colleague. I'm so sorry, I did not catch your name, who's over there. Talking about the other aspects of schools outside of how we're measuring it with test scores and these measures that we've had in place. And looking at school, what I was hearing, and just to paraphrase your words, the school is a community. The school as a safe place. And the school is a place where students can learn that you're talking about bullying, school violence, and all these different things where when we're saying, well, how we make effective schools, if the school does not feel like a community in which every member of that school treats it like a community, then learning math, I keep going back to my subject area today apparently, but learning math is going to be impossible when you're not feeling safe and supported. When we look at teacher reduction rates, I was a bit sad because our graphs are all stopping right around 2017, it seems. So, but if you look at how many teachers we have lost globally, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but looking at that from COVID and looking on COVID, we have such a problem of teacher shortage that we are now getting students in the United States who have a high school diploma to be a long-term substitute in high schools because we do not have teachers, because we do not have a community. So what are we going to do within our communities to have the buy-in so that we are establishing a community so that the school is not something that is standalone, but is an essential piece of a community versus some place that we have to send our students from X hour to X hour every single day. That's looking at that effective change so that the other things can follow. And that's that cohesion, consistency, again, that we are talking about. The establishment of a community. Because if we are actually establishing something based on brain-based research, based on mindfulness, where everybody feels like they have a role and an importance and there's a buy-in to a system because we have a system that's designed to make them citizens of the world and not just test takers, then we can start talking about the other pieces of effective change.
Thank you so much, Brianna, and all our guest speakers. I'm so sorry that our time runs out, so I cannot, accept more questions. But probably you will agree with me. These are the critical and recurring questions and concerns that should be kept open, and we can continue in the future. I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity. I truly enjoyed the event, our Kneller Lecture, yearly Kneller Lecture, and also the wonderful, wonderful comments from our distinguished two commentators. Please, let's give them another round of applause, please.